Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of RPG Radio. My name is Winback and today's Grim Dawn build guide is brought to you by the unending post-apocalyptic need to do battle with all things destructive. This is the Warlord. Today's Warlord in particular is going to be a dual-wielding, hard-swinging spin master that's never been hugged. If you're not aware, a Warlord is a soldier and an Oathkeeper rolled into one crazy physical powerhouse that likes to be in the face of as many enemies as possible. Since this build isn't going to rely on that thing that both of those classes love very much, which is a shield, we're going to have to invest pretty steeply in resistances, defensive ability, and other defensive stats early on. Since this is the first video in the 3-part build guide, we're going to be taking a look at only the abilities that are necessary to play this build, the modifiers that go along with them, and then towards the end we'll check out a couple things that you'll need in order to make this build work apart from the abilities themselves. Most importantly, you will have to purchase a number of relics to allow you to dual wield one-handed weapons with this build, since neither the soldier or the Oathkeeper come with the innate ability to do so. In order to kick things off though, we're going to start with our soldier tree because there are a lot more abilities that we'll be using on this side of things than the Oathkeeper. But the first ability that you'll be picking up for the soldier is going to be cadence, and you can get this with just a single point into the soldier tree because cadence is unlocked very early on. Cadence isn't something that you'll need a lot of points in very early. You can probably stop at 7 once you've gotten to that point if you're still in normal, and then finish up once you hit ultimate for the full 16. Cadence is going to replace every third attack that you do with your soldier with a basically nuclear device. You'll be hitting extremely hard every third swing with cadence, which is why we want to have some decent attack speed on this build to make sure that that hit goes off pretty often. After you've got cadence figured out, you'll pick up discord, which is the first modifier for the ability, and you could put all 3 points into this right away if you'd like. Discord is going to give you a total damage buff to the ability of 10%, along with adding in 72 flat elemental damage with all 3 points, and then converting 100% of the ability's physical damage into elemental damage. This may not make a whole lot of sense right now, but as we get into the late game, we really are going to diversify a lot of that physical damage into elemental damage using gear, devotions, what have you. Once you've pushed the soldier mastery bar a little bit further up, however, you're going to unlock your third ability for this class, which is blitz. And blitz is going to be ultimately a workhorse ability for this build because blitz comes with a very important modifier later on called blindside. For now though, just remember that blitz is a targeted dash ability. You'll click an enemy, dash all the way towards them, deal a whole bunch of weapon damage and physical damage while knocking the targets down for anywhere from 1.5 to 3 seconds at a level 10. If you want to get this up to 6 or 7 points, that is all that you'll need because blitz itself isn't what we're using to get a lot of the damage for this build. It will ultimately fall onto blindside to be that big buff that we need. After hitting that easy point mark for your blitz ability, however, you'll move on to the second modifier for cadence, and that is called fighting form. Not to be confused with fighting spirit, because I know I've had that problem so many times in the past, thinking that I've got some gear that's really helping me when it is going into a dead ability that I have not touched. So basically, fighting form, you're only going to need 1 point. This is just to activate an increased amount of AoE for cadence. So basically, 1 point into fighting form will get you a 2 target maximum and some extra damage in the form of bleeding with your cadence ability. So you can hit more people with cadence, meaning that you should be able to truly thwomp anything that is standing in front of you as long as it doesn't go over the number 2. The next rung of masteries that you will have available are going to be Warcry and Field Command. Both of these abilities are very important for what we're trying to do with this build for a couple of different reasons. Warcry specifically is the ability that you'll want to start putting points into if you want enemies coming at you more often. Warcry actually is a very large AoE, and again, you only have to get it up to about 7 points, and you can just forget about it after that because anything else we get into it is going to come from gear. Warcry actually does damage in a percent health way, so it's going to reduce enemies' health by a percentage depending on the level that you've got in, but at level 12, you'll get a 33% reduction to an enemy's maximum health, meaning that you can do a lot more damage to them a lot more quickly because their health bar has been reduced. It's also going to taunt all the targets in its AoE, so they'll be coming at you just in time for you to unload all of your other damage on top of them, and it's going to reduce the damage that they do by 25%, again at level 12, for 5 seconds. So all of these guys that are running at you because you've taunted them are suddenly going to be dealing a lot less damage to you, meaning that you should be able to shred through them without taking a whole bunch of damage in return. Now the other ability, the field command ability for the warlord, or for the soldier specifically, is very important for very passive reasons. I say passive, but ultimately it's giving us a very big amount of offensive ability, and that is our offensive stat. That's our aggressive stat. That's going to help us do a lot of critting and extra damage when it comes to making this build kill stuff. So at level 12 out of 12, at its maximum range, Field Command is going to give you 86 offensive ability. It's also going to give you 86 defensive ability, and it's going to increase your armor by 25%. So really, you want to get Field Command maxed out for Ultimate, but when you're early on in this build, especially in normal, you really don't have to put more than a few points into it to get a pretty big effect out of the offensive ability. Because defensive ability is much lower in normal and elite than it is in ultimate, you can get away with having a lot lower offensive ability than you would later in the game. So just remember that Field Command does have a lot of very defensive stats, but that offensive stat that it provides is insanely useful for what we're after in this build. Now we have one more ability before we get over to the Blindside part of this conversation for Blitz, but it is still important nonetheless. Decorated Soldier is a soldier passive, you guessed it, and it is going to buff your physical and internal trauma. Now those stats aren't exactly the shiniest thing in the world, so let's just ignore them for now. More importantly than the damage that it's going to buff, Decorated Soldier is going to give you a 20% elemental resistance and a 20% slow resistance. So elemental resistance, just like elemental damage, is the full trifecta of fire, cold, and lightning resistance, and having a 20% built in to your soldier just makes this incredibly easy to not have to worry about elemental resistance components or augments or anything like that as you go further and further into your ultimate experience. So just remember, get this to level 8 if you get there with gear. If you don't have to spend a lot of points to make Decorated Soldier work for you, that's even better, because this passive ability doesn't seem like much, but it is going to take a lot of the burden off of your puzzle thinking skills for the later stages of this build. But now we need to talk about Blindside, which is what I was talking about way too much while we were looking at the base ability of Blitz. Blindside is going to help your Blitz ability hit in a bigger AoE, number 1, with a 5 target maximum at level 12. It's going to have you dealing internal trauma damage with the ability, along with buffing physical and internal trauma damage also. But more importantly than all of that, Blindside is going to reduce a target's defensive ability for 4 seconds. When this is maxed out at 12 out of 12, not overmaxed mind you, it is going to reduce that defensive ability by 270. And that means that all the additional offensive ability that is coming from our gear or our other abilities is going to be massively improved, because we're already taking off, or we're decreasing the ability, the likelihood that the enemy will ignore the chance to get crit. That's a really cyclical way of saying we're just going to crit harder after things get hit with Blitz, and since Blitz gets us into trouble more often than out, you can count on it to make those enemies really squishy. Lots and lots of people will recommend Blitz to you if you have a soldier in your build, and that is specifically the reason. So getting more crit ability for any build that is focused on damage is just really hard to pass up, and blitz just makes it incredibly easy to land that stuff. Now, not to be outdone, there is another modifier that we want to pick up at this point, but that is going to be the modifier for field command, and that's called Squad Tactics. This one is a little bit unassuming, especially in the shadow of Blindside, but Squad Tactics is going to increase all of your damage, and it's going to, more importantly, give you attack and casting speed. The increases for those at just level 8 out of 12 is going to give you 10% of both, meaning that you should be able to land those cadence procs quite a bit faster, along with being able to cast Warcry quicker so that you can get back to swinging your heart out. The last few abilities on the soldier tree, however, are just going to be modifiers and a couple passives, but that doesn't make them any less effective. So, the first one on the list is called Break Morale, and this is the modifier for Warcry. Break Morale is actually going to disrupt any enemy that is hit by it. It's going to basically silence their abilities for 6 seconds, which is an enormous AoE to turn off the abilities of lots and lots of enemies. It's crazy just how good a utility this modifier offers. It's also going to reduce the target's physical resistances for 5 seconds, and physical resistances apply specifically to internal trauma damage. So some of the damage that this build is going to be doing will be made better because Break Morale is reducing that physical resistance for enemies. On this same tier, we've got the final upgrade for cadence, and that is called Deadly Momentum, and this is actually going to activate over a duration when the cadence proc goes off. So for 5 seconds, every time that you hit a cadence, you're going to get a very big buff to your flat physical damage as well as your internal trauma damage. Both those stats are going to jump up, and then you are going to get additional buffs on top of that to the overall damage that you're doing. So you're increasing the floor and you are increasing the ceiling with Deadly Momentum for 5 seconds every time that you land a cadence. And believe me when I say it's not very hard to do that. So you'll want to get this one all the way up to level 12 out of 12 so you can get the maximum bonus from it, because cadence is very important when it comes to facing down the big bads with their big bad health bars. There is another ability on the Oathkeeper side of things that will be doing a lot of our AoE damage, but cadence really is going to be doing most of our single target high health murder damage. After you've completed your Deadly Momentum journey, you're going to take Scars of Battle for the same reason that you took Decorated Soldier. Scars of Battle is going to increase your armor absorption by 25%, and given that all of your base armor absorption is 70%, we're basically jumping this thing up almost 100 to 100% through just this single ability. So at level 8 out of 8, you'll have 25% increased armor absorption, making your armor almost 100% efficient in taking damage, as well as a couple of other very important resistances. So your bleeding resistance is almost, well, a third of it is taken care of through Scars of Battle alone. You're going to get 32% bleeding resistance with 8 points out of 8. If you can overmax this ability with gear, you're going to have an even higher amount, but remember, bleeding resistance doesn't get reduced until you get into Ultimate, so it is definitely one of those resistances that people forget about once they start going through Elite and worrying even harder about their reduction in those resistances. That being said, it's a very big chunk. Just remember, get this fixed up quick so that you can make the best use of that bleeding res. This ability is also going to put a ton of work into your reduced stun duration resistance, which isn't actually reduced by increasing the difficulty. So once you hit 80% for reduced stun duration, that's it. You don't have to worry about it anymore. 32% of 80 though is a big chunk, and if we can get that out of the way with a single ability that's already doing a lot of other great stuff for our build, there's really no reason to ignore it. We're also getting another kind of rare stat through Scars of Battle, which is the reduction of freeze duration. So freezing and stunning a character are obviously two different ways to crowd control you by enemies, but reducing that amount by the same 32% is a very hefty way of really making sure that you can do as much damage as often as possible without having to stop. So, Scars of Battle is one of those passive abilities that looks pretty boring on paper, but is doing really, really good things for you if you are a soldier and you want to be in melee range of all those other big bad guys. And then we have the final passive ability to our build on the soldier tree, and that is Oleron's Rage. This is going to be an exclusive passive skill, and only one of those can be activated at a time, so we're going to take Oleron's Rage over the Divine Mandate of the Oathkeeper class for a couple of different reasons. Oleron's Rage specifically is going to add a flat internal trauma damage to your pool. It's going to buff your physical, pierce, and internal trauma damage, as well as giving you a big chunk of movement speed, which is a stat that we don't see very often. But more importantly than all of those things, Oleron's Rage is going to give you a % increase to your offensive ability. And this goes up 1% with every point, so if you get it to 12 out of 12, you've got a 12% increase to your offensive ability pool. If you get this overmaxed, which we definitely want to focus on with our gear, we can get it even higher than that. So that means Oleron's Rage is giving us another very big bump to offensive ability so that we can lay the critical hit smackdown on so many bad guys. You'll start baking cookies and sending letters to this guy's grandma because he'll be doing so much work for you. But that's it for your soldier tree. So if you have any takeaways from all of those abilities, remember, we're doing a lot of focusing on offensive ability. We're doing a lot of focusing on the ability to reduce the enemy's defensive ability so that we can crit them, and we want to be able to hit them extremely hard with our ability Cadence, as well as our War Cry. So all of that rolled into the next set of abilities that we're going to talk about is our Oathkeeper tree. Now, the first ability that you're going to pick up for the Oathkeeper is a passive ability, and it's going to very easily correlate to some of our soldier passives. But Presence of Virtue is a 100% all the time active passive ability that you have with the Oathkeeper, and you'll want to get this maxed out for the full 12 out of 12. While Presence of Virtue is going on, it's giving you a chance to do internal trauma or bleeding damage whenever you deal damage, but more importantly than that, it's giving you a very substantial amount of offensive ability on the floor side of things. So we're getting a flat bonus to offensive ability from Presence of Virtue. So at level 12 out of 12, when this thing is completely maxed out, you're getting another 133 offensive ability, which again, we can roll that right back into Oleron's Rage and take 10%. If you've got that at level 10, you're already adding on another 13 offensive ability, bringing that up to 146 OA just from Presence of Virtue and its combination with Oleron's Rage. After that, it's also going to give you physical damage retaliation, which is never a bad thing because when you get hit, you're just getting free damage back. After you've taken care of your initial Presence of Virtue, though, you can move on over to Vire's Might, and this might be a shocker, but we're only going to take 1 point into Vire's Might. There's really no other reason, because Vire's Might is going to be mainly a mobility tool for this build. The reason I say that is because Blitz has to be targeted on an enemy to go up to hit them, which is when you'll start doing your damage, but even though you have your spacebar dash, you'll definitely want to have a secondary movement ability with this build because things can get a little bit squishy at times, especially depending on the boss that you're up against. So Vire's Might will be used as a freeform dash. You only need 1 point in it in order to make that dash happen, and it is a very significant get out of dodge when you are about to die button. After that, you're going to wait a whole bunch of time on the Oathkeeper side of your build to put points into Rebuke. Now, Rebuke is the third modifier, or I guess the second modifier of 3 abilities for Presence of Virtue. But Rebuke is essentially going to give you another big bump to your flat physical damage, so you're bringing that floor up again, and you're also getting buffs to your reflected damage reduction, as well as your life reduction resistance. So those are 2 stats that you will almost never see in a lot of other passives for other classes, but specifically those 2 types of damage are going to be incredibly painful when it gets into ultimate because of the way that we deal damage. Since we don't just delete a single person with 1 ability, we do have some potential to get our cadence to hit us right back in the face, and that's never a good thing. So basically, we're reducing the amount of damage that we're going to take reflected back from enemies, and they're not going to be able to as easily reduce our maximum health bar with some of those bigger boss abilities as you get into ultimate. So all of that stuff to say, this is an incredibly good defensive tool, as well as buffing up your flat offense for your physical damage and all the buffs that it gives to your retaliation damage. Now, the next ability that we're going to talk about is much more flashy, and this honestly is the whole reason that I even picked the Oathkeeper to go into this whole Warlord build, because I really don't use the Eye of Reckoning nearly enough. Eye of Reckoning is the premier spinning damage dealing whirlwind ability for Grim Dawn, and there is a reason that we want to use it, because it's just so cool. The Eye of Reckoning is an ability that we're going to want to put maximum points in, and we're going to go even further than that to overmax it with some gear, because Eye of Reckoning and Cadence are going to be our 2 biggest damage dealers for this build. So, Eye of Reckoning is going to deal a hefty amount of damage and a very big AoE all around you while you're spinning, and it's going to be dealing some of that damage through your weapon, as well as its own physical and fire damage. We can also pick a couple of monster infrequents to make this even stronger, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. The ability itself will ramp up in damage as you spin, and if you are thinking about how it is going to interact with your movement abilities, even your dash, remember that even though it will cancel, Eye of Reckoning does still spin ever so slightly as you activate those buttons. So the downtime on Eye of Reckoning, it doesn't start immediately when you hit your movement abilities, but it will turn off. So if you're channeling it and you hit your Vire's Might or your dash or your blitz, you'll channel a little bit and then it'll stop, but then you'll go right back to channeling immediately, which is why I super recommend putting it on your right click so you don't hurt your fingers too hard. Now, after you've got those points into Eye of Reckoning, we've got one little old point into Tectonic Shift, and Tectonic Shift is the 3rd modifier for Vire's Might. This is only for the increased range of Vire's Might, adding another 3 meters onto it, and we get a 0.1 second off of its cooldown. Don't much care about the cooldown for this Vire's Might in this build as it is, because we have a number of other mobility options. Vire's Might is mostly used as a fallback ability to really get you in and out of things. As it stands right now, it's only really just a panic button, since we don't have a tried and true blade barrier or a mirror of Arioctes. We're using Vire's Might as an escape tool if we're all out of other options. So it's easy enough to make that range even bigger, making your escape plans a lot easier, and that's all there is to say about this single point into Tectonic Shift. But there is one more ability modifier that we need to talk about for the Oathkeeper, and that is the upgrade to our Eye of Reckoning called Soulfire. Soulfire, while also having a super cool title, is going to add physical damage and lightning damage to your Eye of Reckoning in the form of tiny circling lightning balls that will basically activate whenever you hit anybody with your Eye of Reckoning. So you'll see them start to spin around quite a bit, meaning that you can really use Eye of Reckoning to help you deal damage to some very stationary big bosses. So things like your Loghorian or your Warden down in his cellar, as long as you're standing right up there in his face, if they're not moving, Soulfire is spinning around, hitting them over and over and over again, just like a Targo's mallet from our last build. So, all that being said, Soulfire also reduces the target's damage by almost 20% for 2 seconds, and considering how often these things spin and hit enemies repeatedly, we can get a pretty decent chunk of that 20% reduction in damage happening quite a bit. So when you are up against bigger bosses, really you'll dash in, you'll use blitz to reduce the defensive ability, you'll hit a couple cadences while that reduction in defensive ability is happening. Your war cry will go off at some point just because it never hurts to hit that button every time that you can. And then after you've run through that rotation, you'll start to use Eye of Reckoning for damage so that you can get the Soulfire out and continually move around with your Eye of Reckoning and dodge decent chunks of damage from those big bosses. So while you are spinning, you're not being actively hit by skill shots from the bosses, and you're reducing their damage too. So really, it's just remember to spin after you let your whole salvo go, and repeat, rinse, repeat. There you go. And that's it for all of the abilities for this Warlord. Now there are a few items that you will also need, so we're going to start those, make it real quick so we can wrap this up and you can get on to your own journey. But the Bladesworn Talisman is the level 25 version of the relic that you'll need to activate any character into a two-handed build. Since we don't have something like a Nightblade or an Inquisitor to dual-wield weapons, we need a Bladesworn Talisman, and that just passively gives you the ability to dual-wield one-handed weapons. So, once you use this, you'll be able to equip 2 very cool monster infrequents, though you will need to start into Act 7 in order to pick them up. That being said, Act 7 isn't a huge deal. You have access to it right out of the gate in Act 1, so if you wanted to go ahead and kick that off for your experience, I can't not recommend it. But the Rift Claw Slicer and the Sand Claw Slicer are 2 weapons that will massively improve a couple of things going on with your build. First of all, the Rift Claw Slicer is going to add fire damage to your Eye of Reckoning and is going to convert 100% of the physical damage that your Eye of Reckoning does into fire damage. So you're basically a spinning flame tornado of doom. Not only that, but you're spitting out lightning bolts that are making everybody weaker, so you can see why that's a good thing to do. On the other hand, you'll have your Sandclaw Slicer, which is going to add a bunch of flat physical damage to Presence of Virtue, and it's going to add another 10% attack speed onto the ability. So if you have your squad tactics maxed out for that 10%, and you just have this weapon equipped, you're now looking at 20% attack speed through Presence of Virtue just for picking up this single weapon. They're both really easy to find as well, so just remember when you're hunting down those raptor-type enemies in Act 7, they're going to be very likely to drop these axes for you. That being said, those 3 pieces of gear really should bump the amount of damage that you can do with this build, apart from maxing out all the abilities as soon as you possibly can. But that's it, everybody. You made it to the end of the video, the first part of the Warlord build guide, who's going to be spinning, slapping, and just generally having a good time in front of tons and tons of enemies. We'll be back next week to talk all about devotions going into the elite difficulty for this build, but after that, we'll be looking at our ultimate difficulty build, getting this build maxed out, getting all the best gear, augments, components, everything that you could want under the sun to make sure that our Warlord is having an absolutely Warlord of a time. Until then, everybody, this is Winback signing off. Peace out.